welcome to this final GCSE History Predicted Paper walkthrough. This is day 7 of 7. Well done if you have already looked at the walkthroughs for Elizabeth Paper A to C and American West Paper A to C. This is the final American West walkthrough. As per usual with the other videos, have a go at the questions before you watch the video. All of the predicted papers are on your whole cohort Google Classroom. You should self-assess the answers you write based on the model answers in this video and also on the mark schemes provided. What do the model answers have that your answers don't? There's not always one correct way of answering questions, and other approaches may be valid. And if you're unsure, ask your teacher or ask me. Let's start with consequences first of all. You're not just describing, you are analysing and you are explaining the impact on the wider West with good knowledge and understanding. Specific information is the key to level 2. So you've got to explain one consequence of the Timber Culture Act. You could easily write about what the Timber Culture Act is, but you need to focus on what happens because of it, because that's what a consequence is. So your key consequences of the Timber Culture Act. More land claimed by settlers. This is the most obvious one. If in doubt, go for that. You could also say that the Timber Culture Act led to homesteaders trying to adapt the plains environment. We're going to look at what that means. You could also say that a consequence of the act was that some settlers exploited it for profit. So here's our first consequence. This is our banker consequence. So go for this one if in doubt. One consequence of the Timber Culture Act was that more land was claimed by settlers on the plains. The Act was passed in 1873 and allowed homesteaders to claim an extra 160 acres of land if they promised to plant trees on a quarter of it. By 1878, around 16 million acres had been claimed under the Act. This encouraged further settlement because migrants had the chance to gain more land and create larger farms in the West. So you've got specific knowledge, clear consequence identified, and clear explanation of how more land is claimed by settlers leads to further settlement. Here's your second one, a bit more niche but acceptable. One consequence of the Timber Culture Act was that homesteaders tried to adapt the plains environment to make farming more successful. The plains had very few natural trees, which meant settlers lacked timber for houses, fences, furniture, and fuel. Trees could also act as windbreaks, protecting crops from strong plains winds. This led to settlers changing the landscape of the West by making the plains more suitable for permanent farming, leading to more settlers being able to survive on the plains and the growth of farming communities. So in underlined text here, we have the developed explanation linking to the wider West. Final consequence. One consequence of the Timber Culture Act was that some settlers exploited it for profit rather than using it for genuine farming. The Act allowed settlers to claim an extra 160 acres if they promised to plant trees on part of it. But some people claimed the land, waited for land prices to rise, and then sold their claims for profit. This meant the Act did not always create successful farms or solve the lack of timber on the plains because some claimants were more interested in making money than permanent settlement. As a result, the Act contributed to a wider problem in the West. Land did not always end up with genuine homesteaders who would farm it successfully. This is a wider issue then, and it's linked to the Homestead Act of 1862, which I don't expect to come up this year, but who knows. Under the Homestead Act, individuals were allowed to claim 160 acres, but you couldn't get more than one homestead. So business owners and bosses got their employees to snap up claims and then sell it to them to exploit the Act. Timber Culture Act, very similar. Explain one consequence of the Exoduster movement, 1879. This is highly likely to come up, this or the Oklahoma Land Rush, or both. So here's the story of the Exoduster movement. Slavery ends after the Civil War in 1865. However, African Americans are still restricted by black codes, which are discriminating against them, and many of them are working as sharecroppers. In addition, the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, in the South are using violence and intimidation against African Americans, which is pushing families out of the South. They're pulled to Kansas. Kansas was a free state during the Civil War, which means it was free of slavery, and Benjamin Singleton led the Exodusters, and he used leaflets to encourage them to migrate to Kansas. There was also a rumour that the land was free, even though it wasn't, and that's what encouraged 40,000 Exodusters to leave the South for Kansas and nearby states by the end of 1879. However, when they arrived, they faced problems. They arrived with little money, they couldn't afford tools, barbed wire or seeds, and the best land was claimed by the whites. However, in spite of these problems, some Exodusters built successful communities like Nicodemus, and others returned south or moved elsewhere in the west. So if you were writing a narrative account on this, you've got a clear beginning, middle and end. We're only focused on the consequences, what happens as a result of this. So we're looking really at our last 3 boxes, and here's some of the consequences we could go for. So our first one would be increased African American settlement in Kansas. Our second one, new African American communities were built. Third consequence, many of the Exodusters struggled economically. And finally, tension increased with white settlers in Kansas. First consequence. One consequence of the Exoduster movement was increased African American settlement in Kansas. In 1879, thousands of African Americans left the South, and by the end of the year, around 40,000 Exodusters had migrated to Kansas and neighbouring states. Many chose Kansas because it had been a free state since 1861 and symbolised hope, freedom, and opportunity. This led to the population of Kansas becoming more diverse, with the West becoming a place where formerly enslaved people tried to build new lives. So again, clear consequence identified, supporting information, explanation linked to the wider West. A second consequence you could go for. One consequence of the Exoduster movement was that new African American communities were built in the West. Some Exodusters settled in towns such as Nicodemus in Kansas, where African American migrants built homes, schools, churches, shops, and businesses. These communities allowed Exodusters to support each other and try to protect their rights in a new environment. This led to the creation of new communities with their own institutions and identities as permanent African American settlements were established on the plains. If I had this question, I'd go for that. Next consequence, many Exodusters struggled economically. So one consequence of the Exoduster movement was that many African American migrants struggled economically after arriving in Kansas. Much of the best land had already been taken by white farmers and ranchers, and many Exodusters arrived with very little money. Some had believed false rumours that land would be given away for free, so they spent money on registering their land claims and could not afford essential equipment such as tools, seeds and barbed wire. This led to increased tension because poor migrants often struggled to survive because land, farming, equipment and good conditions were difficult to secure, so they felt aggrieved that migration did not guarantee success. So this is a good consequence because it uses my favourite way of explaining a consequence by talking about whether it increases or decreases tension. Finally, tension increased with white settlers. So one consequence of the Exoduster movement was increased tension with white settlers in Kansas. Many white residents treated Exodusters with hostility because they saw them as competition for land, jobs and business. Although Kansas offered more hope than the South, African Americans still faced discrimination and inequality after migrating west. For instance, most of the best farming land was already owned by whites. This increased tension in some Western communities because racial tension and prejudice did not disappear when migrants left the South, and it revealed that settlements in the West could create conflict as well as opportunities. So that's the Exoduster movement and its consequences in a nutshell. Narrative account, and I've picked a nasty one. Write a narrative account analysing the changing role of cowboys, 1862 to 76. And I've given some interesting bullet points. So Joseph McCoy and Abilene, so cow towns, change the role of cowboys, leads to more long drives, and barbed wire, which leads to more ranch work. So my top tip on this question is to focus on the role of cowboys rather than the lifestyle of cowboys. So the cow towns lead to cowboys being paid at the end of drives and spending their money in hotels, saloons, casinos and brothels, but that's not about their role. That's about their lifestyle. So at each stage of your narrative, we need to analyse what is changing about the role of the cowboys. Here's how I would do my narrative. I'd start at the beginning of the period, cowboys are working as general ranch workers. Abilene is the big turning point. This leads to more cowboys working on long drives. And then ranching under John Iliffe is your next turning point. This makes cowboys' roles harder and more restricted. So here's how I would structure my narrative. I have my first paragraph here. Before the rapid growth of the cattle industry, the role of cowboys on the plains was mainly local ranch work. Cowboys moved cattle to new grazing grounds, protected herds from wild animals, and stopped cattle being stolen. Their work was important, but it was usually based around ranches rather than long-distance journeys to national markets. This meant that at the start of a period, cowboys were general ranch workers rather than highly specialised workers on major cattle drives. At the next paragraph, at the start of the next paragraph, we need a linking sentence. It's in bold. However, this role as ranch workers changed significantly when cattle trails and cow towns made long drives more important. After Joseph McCoy developed Abilene as a cow town in 1867, Texas cattle could be driven along the Chisholm Trail to Abilene and then sent east by rail. This meant cowboys were now needed to move thousands of cattle across long distances. Their role became more organised and specialised. They took part in spring roundups, separated cattle by brand, and then drove herds to railheads. A long drive usually involved about 12 cowboys, including a trail boss, cook, flank riders, wranglers, and drag riders. Cowboys now became essential workers in connecting Texas cattle to eastern markets. That paragraph's quite long, but it has lots of good detail about the role of cowboys on the long drive. We now need to link to ranching. However, as ranching became more common on the plains, the cowboys' role began to change again. Instead of only driving cattle long distances from Texas to cow towns, more cowboys worked on open-range ranches, especially as ranches such as John Iliffe proved cattle could be raised directly on the plains. Cowboys carried out winter line riding, patrolling the edges of ranch land, bringing back stray cattle and protecting herds in harsh weather. From 1874, barbed wire also began to restrict the open range because homesteaders used it to fence their land, protect crops, and block cattle from wells. This meant cowboys increasingly worked in a more restricted and contested environment, where their role involved managing cattle on ranches and dealing with the limits created by fencing. This is a top-level narrative because the knowledge and understanding is strong, but it also analyses the linkage and the change over time, and that's what the question is asking about, the changing role of cowboys. Finally, explain the importance. Top-level importance answers show analysis of importance with a line of reasoning that is coherent, i.e. makes sense and logically structured. You're not mixing things up. With accurate and relevant information and good knowledge and understanding. So, explain the importance of a gunfight at the OK Corral for law and order in the West. Explain the importance of indigenous peoples of the plains' attitudes to property for relations with the US government. And explain the importance of attempts to tackle lawlessness for law and order in the West, 1835 to 51. So there are some tricky questions here. You get 2 from a choice of 3, and you write 2 paragraphs on the 2 you choose. So 4 paragraphs total for 16 marks. Although it's very unlikely for 2 law and order questions to come up on importance on the same paper, it's not impossible. However, I'd say you're likely to get 1. So it could be one of these. So make sure you're ready for both. Importance of a gunfight at the OK Corral for law and order in the West. You could easily get bogged down into writing the story of a gunfight, talking about the Earps, the Clantons and the McClarys. Your focus needs to be, what did the gunfight show or reveal about law and order, and what changed because of it? That's how we explain importance. So, it reveals or demonstrates that business interests increasingly wanted law and order, and we got evidence from the gunfight there. The gunfights also exposed the problem of violent law enforcement. It's also important because the gunfight led to revenge attacks and showed that law enforcement could worsen conflict. It also encouraged stronger town government and more formal law enforcement. If I were doing this, I would definitely do the last one, the 4th one, and then any one of 1, 2, or 3. Depends what mood I was in. I'm going to show you all of them. One reason why the gunfight at the OK Corral was important for law and order in the West was because it demonstrated that business interests increasingly wanted law and order. Tombstone, Arizona had grown rapidly as a silver mining town, with businesses such as saloons, casinos, brothels and shops developing around the mining industry. However, groups such as the Clantons and McClarys were linked to cattle rustling, alcohol smuggling, drinking and gambling, which threatened Tombstone's reputation and stability. The mine owners and businessmen therefore supported stronger law enforcement and backed the Earps in trying to control the cowboys. This was important because it showed that as western towns became wealthier, business owners wanted safer, more respectable towns where banks, lawyers and investors could operate. Without the gunfight at the OK Corral, the clash between violent cowboy culture and the business demand for stronger law and order would have been less clearly exposed. So the underlined explanation for importance is vital here. This is explaining how, if there were no gunfight, what would have changed, what would have been less clear. Second reason for importance. One reason why the gunfight at the OK Corral was important for law and order in the West was because it exposed the problem of violent law enforcement. Virgil Earp was a deputy US Marshal, but the Earps were also experienced gunfighters, and Wyatt Earp had a controversial past involving gambling, saloon ownership, and an arrest for horse theft. On the 26th of October 1881, the Earps confronted the armed Clantons and McClarys near the OK Corral, leading to a gunfight in which Tom and Frank McClary and Billy Clanton were killed, while Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. This was important because it showed that law enforcement in the West could be brutal and difficult to separate from gun violence. Without the gunfight, it would have been less obvious that some lawmen kept order through force in ways that made them appear almost as violent as the criminals they were trying to control. Our third reason is that it led to revenge attacks, so let's look at that. One reason why the gunfight at the OK Corral was important for law and order in the West was because it led to revenge attacks and showed that violent law enforcement could worsen conflict. After the gunfight, the Clantons and McClarys claimed that the Earps had committed murder, although the Earps were found not guilty in court. The remaining cowboys then carried out revenge attacks. Virgil Earp was wounded and Morgan Earp was killed. Public opinion turned against the Earps and they were eventually driven out of Tombstone. This was important because it showed that using violence to impose law and order could intensify feuds and make towns even more unstable. Without the gunfight, the conflict between the Earps and the cowboys may not have escalated into revenge attacks, but made law enforcement look like part of the problem. So, clear reason for importance, first sentence, lots of good detail, key names. Explanation of importance uses that keyword without. What would have changed if the gunfight had never taken place? And finally, the one I would definitely write about. One reason why the gunfight at the OK Corral was important for law and order in the West was because it encouraged stronger town government and more formal law enforcement. After the Earps were driven out of Tombstone, the town council took extra steps to improve order. They hired new lawmen who strictly enforced weapons laws, invested in law courts and a jail, and used new technology such as the telegraph to share information across longer distances with marshals, judges and state or federal governments. This was important because it showed a move away from relying on famous gunfighters and towards more organised systems of law enforcement. Without the gunfight and the disorder that followed it, towns such as Tombstone may have been slower to recognise the need for courts, jails, weapon controls and better communication to maintain law and order. Key detail here, new technology like the telegraph. I'd be talking about that because that's a key feature of law and order in the later period of the course. Next importance question. The importance of Indigenous peoples of the Plains' attitudes to property for relations with the US government. So, your key knowledge. Indigenous peoples believed land was sacred and could not be owned, bought or sold by individuals. Land was used communally, especially for hunting, and farming and mining could be seen as disrespectful because it disrupted the spirit world. How does that affect relations with the US government? That's the tricky bit of this question. It leads to misunderstandings over treaties and land ownership. It leads to conflict over farming and mining. It leads to conflict over shared hunting grounds. It leads to US government policy becoming more controlling. If I was doing this, I'd do 2 and 3, maybe 1. Less likely 4, but I'm going to show you what it would look like. So, first paragraph. First reason. One reason why Indigenous peoples' attitudes to property were important for relations with the US government was because they created misunderstandings over treaties and land ownership. Many Indigenous peoples of the plains believed land was sacred and could not be owned, bought or sold by individuals. Instead, land was used communally by the tribe, especially for hunting buffalo. However, the US government treated land as property that could be legally transferred through treaties and often believed chiefs could give up land on behalf of whole tribes. This was important for relations because the government believed treaties gave it legal control over land, while many Indigenous peoples did not believe land could be permanently sold. Without these different attitudes to property, treaties between the US government and Indigenous peoples may have created less mistrust and conflict. Developed explanation underlined here, and good knowledge and understanding about those attitudes to property and how it creates misunderstandings. Second reason for importance, conflict over farming and mining. So one reason why Indigenous peoples' attitudes to property were important for relations with the US government was because they led to conflict over farming and mining. Many Indigenous peoples believed humans were part of nature and that land, plants and animals had spirits. This meant activities such as ploughing land for farming or digging into the earth for mining could be seen as disrespectful. However, white settlers and the US government believed land should be used productively through farming, mining, building and settlement. This was important for relations because the government treated land as property that should be improved, farmed and mined, while Indigenous people saw land as sacred and shared. Without these different attitudes to land use, there may have been less conflict between Indigenous peoples and the US government over whether a plain should be farmed, mined, or left for traditional use. So that's how the belief attitudes to property, particularly land, led to changing relations with the US government. Next one, conflict over shared hunting grounds. We see this particularly in Fort Laramie, the first Fort Laramie Treaty, which I'm pretty sure will come up. One reason why Indigenous peoples' attitudes to property were important for relations with the US government was because they led to conflict over shared hunting grounds. Indigenous peoples did not usually see hunting land as private property belonging to one individual. Instead, different bands and tribes often used large areas of land communally so they could follow the buffalo herds. However, the US government preferred fixed boundaries and defined territories, as seen in treaties such as the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. This was important for relations because the US government tried to divide land into fixed territories, while Indigenous peoples often treated hunting grounds as shared land that could be used by different bands following the buffalo. Without this clash, relations may have been less tense because Indigenous peoples would not have been expected to stay within territories that restricted their traditional way of life. So because Indigenous peoples believe that hunting ground should be shared, leads to this clash, leads to this conflict with the US government. Final one. One reason why Indigenous peoples' attitudes to properties were important was because their belief in communal land ownership led the US government to try to replace Indigenous property ideas with white American private ownership. The US government believed that Indigenous people should adopt white American ideas of land ownership, farming and settlement. Because Indigenous peoples used land communally and moved across the plains to hunt buffalo, many white Americans argued that they were not using the land properly. This attitude helped justify policies such as reservations and later the Dawes Act, which divided tribal land into individual plots. This was important for relations because US policy increasingly aimed to destroy communal land ownership and replace it with private property, attacking Indigenous ways of life. Without this clash over property, US policy may have been less controlling, as the government would have had less reason to interfere directly with Indigenous land. So that's a really complex paragraph and a really complex reason to analyse, but they believe in communal land ownership. So each one of these 4 reasons for importance takes a different attitude of Indigenous peoples towards property and explains how it affects relations with the US government. Really tricky question, but you've got some examples here. Finally, Importance of attempts to tackle lawlessness for law and order in the West. Early period. They don't focus on examples of crime, don't talk about road agents or claim jumping or sorting claims or anything like that. Your focus is on the solutions, the attempts to tackle lawlessness. The main one is federal law enforcement. This is important because it created an official legal structure. Second reason, we move on to the unofficial law enforcement, starting with land clubs. Land clubs are important because they reduce disputes over land claims. Third one, vigilance committees, my favourite. Vigilance committees act quickly. Yes, they settle old scores, but they act quickly against criminals. So it both helps law and order and makes it worse. And finally, mining courts. Mining courts are important because they settle mining disputes. So let's look at each of these. Before we do that, you need to think what the significance is of each of these attempts for law and order. That's what we're getting into for importance. If we start with federal law enforcement. One reason why attempts to tackle lawlessness were important for law and order in the West was because federal law enforcement created an official legal structure. Western territories were controlled by the federal government before they became states, and the government appointed a governor, 3 judges, and a US Marshal. US Marshals could also hire deputies and call on ordinary citizens to form a posse to help catch criminals. This was important for law and order because it meant the West did not have to rely entirely on individuals, mobs, or informal justice. There was at least an official system of courts, law officers, and legal authority. Without federal law enforcement, law and order in the West would have been even weaker because there would have been fewer recognised officials with the authority to arrest criminals, hold trials, and enforce the law. So yes, we know it's not that effective, but it does at least create an official legal structure. You could, of course, write another paragraph, fifth option, on the election of sheriffs as well, and talk about the problems sheriffs had and why that made law and order even more difficult. Second reason we're going to look at those land clubs. One reason why attempts to tackle lawlessness were important for law and order in the West was because land clubs helped reduce disputes over land claims. In early settlement, arguments often broke out over claim jumping, where one settler tried to take land already claimed by another. Land clubs were created by settlers to protect the first people to claim land, and they often had a constitution, elected officers, judges, and rules for settling disputes. This was important for law and order because land disputes could easily lead to violence if there was no accepted way to decide who had the right to a claim. Without land clubs, settlers would have had fewer ways to settle land disputes peacefully, making claim jumping and violent arguments over land more likely. So land clubs are important because they reduce disputes over land claims, and without them, there'd have been fewer ways to do this peacefully, more likely to have claim jumping. Third reason, vigilance committees. One reason why attempts to tackle lawlessness were important for law and order in the West was because vigilance committees acted quickly against criminals when official law enforcement was weak. Vigilance committees were groups of citizens who took the law into their own hands. For example, in San Francisco in 1851, a vigilance committee acted against the Sydney Duck scandal, lynching 4 members and forcing another 28 to leave the city. Vigilance committees could include wealthy business owners and in some cases groups of up to 200 men. This was important for law and order because it showed that local communities could respond quickly when courts, sheriffs and marshals seemed too slow or ineffective. Without vigilance committees, some towns may have felt even less protected from crime, although their use of lynching in brief trials also showed that attempts to tackle lawlessness could become violent and unfair. Don't necessarily need to put the last bit of that in, but I think it's important to consider how vigilance committees are not perfect when it comes to tackling law and order. And for an importance question, where you don't have to explain one consequence and you're just explaining the importance, that's perfectly valid. Lastly, mining court. One reason why attempts to tackle lawlessness were important for law and order in the West was because mining courts helped settle disputes in mining communities. During the gold rush, miners often argued over claims, especially when people tried claim jumping or sorting claims to trick others. Mining camps created their own rules, appointed a recorder to keep track of claims, and used respected community members or juries to judge disputes. This was important for law and order because mining courts gave prospectors a way to resolve arguments without immediately turning to violence. Without mining courts, disputes over gold claims would have been more likely to lead to fighting, revenge, and disorder in mining camps where official law enforcement was often limited. That's it. Well done for getting to the end of a walkthrough. Day 7 of 7, final walkthrough for paper 2. Hope you found these videos useful, and very best of luck with your paper 2 exam. Hopefully some of these questions come up. Bye bye for now.